Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to introduce your next speaker. You obviously already know him. I'm sure you know him from a lot of different angles here at Northwood University. But I've had the pleasure, the privilege of knowing Dale Matcheck for almost 2 decades now. And indirectly, I've known Dale for just about all of his life because he's a youngster. And my relationship with the Matcheck family goes back to Ann Arbor and to the fact that my younger brother is one of Dale's older brother's best friends. And it's that friendship and that family connection that allowed Northwood University to know about Dr. Dale Matcheck. Dale Matcheck is an honors graduate of the University of Michigan in economics. He's a PhD graduate of Cornell University in the Ivy League in economics, and he is the chair of our economics department. But the thing that's important that you may not know is that we stole Dale Matcheck from the University of Michigan's economics department because Dale was looking for a school where he could be more involved with students and teach more free market economics than he was at the time. And it was a wonderful opportunity for Northwood University. Since Dale's been at Northwood University, he's been a stellar member of our faculty. He has led the economics department. He finished an anthology, a publication on environmental economics for us. He's the co-author of When We Are Free. He's not only an excellent teacher and a scholar, he is a wonderful family man and a wonderful human being. It is my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Dale Matcheck.
Wow, that was very nice, Tim.
Tell him what you said.
I feel like I just attended my own funeral. Okay, well, today I'm going to talk to you about a topic that I think will be of great interest to you. I know that as we choose the speakers, some of them appeal to you, some of them don't. The topics that are discussed, some seem relevant, some aren't. But I hear from students, especially those that are graduating, a certain amount of anxiety about the job market, a certain amount of anxiety about whether or not life is going to be easy. The transition from your college years to economic independence is a little bit more difficult, perhaps, a little bit less clear than it was for past generations. And of course, it's not just young people who feel that way. It's many people who feel that in some ways life is getting harder for the great mass of people. It's getting harder to make a living. And so that's what I'm here to talk to you about. What is happening to the American dream? What is happening to the middle class? Is that lifestyle still attainable for the great mass of Americans? And my answer in brief is that it is attainable. And in fact, I think I'm fairly optimistic about the future of the middle class. But another thing that I want to emphasize during today's presentation is that it really is going to require individual initiative. It's going to require probably a lot more judgment, creativity, courage, perhaps, than it did for prior generations, because we do live in a different world. So let's begin. With a quote from Janet Smithson. Janet Smithson, University of Manchester in England, did a survey of people your age, and this is what she found out. People age 25 couldn't imagine that they'd be in a position to have children or get married. Or for some, it was about being able to move out of their parents' home. They couldn't imagine this without secure income. They couldn't see an end to this. So it just verifies, again, what I've been hearing from individuals about this future. In fact, they developed a name for it. It's called the quarter-life crisis. You've heard of the midlife crisis. Midlife crisis, people wake up after half their career and say, oh my gosh, what am I doing? This is not a meaningful life. I've got to figure out what I really want to do with my life. But apparently this is happening much earlier in life. Now, just because I put the slide up doesn't mean I'm advocating this course of action. I do want you to be proactive in dealing with your quarter-life crisis, but there are more effective ways. And in fact, there's an entire industry developing, giving you lots of assistance and information about how to take charge of your life, how to figure out what you want to do, where you want to go, how you're going to get there. In fact, this particular book has a website associated with it that I highly recommend. And I've recommended it to my own college-age children, and I just found some wonderful resources there for career planning, financial planning, even relationships. And so, I don't know because I haven't read the book, but it's one of an emerging genre designed to help people cope with the economic anxiety of the age. Here's a quote from Robert F. Kennedy that he gave in a speech in 1966 to a group of college students. And I think it's a different context today, but I think it applies to you as well. The Chinese curse which says, "May he live in interesting times." Why do you suppose that's a curse? Don't you want to live in interesting times? No. Kind of interesting, but not too interesting, right? And one of the reasons why Robert F. Kennedy had such appeal to young people of his time is that he was essentially optimistic. And of course it was an optimistic time, the 1960s. He says, we live in interesting times. There are times of danger and uncertainty, but they are also the most creative of any time in the history of mankind. And I think that is clearly applicable to our own age. So I'm going to take the whole morning to talk to you about this. I want to divide my talk into three distinct parts. So during the first hour, I want to talk about the state of the middle class in America. During the second, actually this is out of order. I've changed the order as of last night. So the third thing I want to talk about is rising inequality, looking at the numbers. No, actually, no, this is right. I didn't change it. Well, I'll figure it out before the next hour, don't worry. And then the third topic, I want to look at some philosophical perspectives on inequality. You may have heard a lot of concern about how inequality in America has reached levels unseen since the 1920s. Well, how should we feel about that? So let's start with some clarification. What do we mean by middle class? If you ask Americans if they're middle class, most of them, regardless of their income, will say yes. Surveys show that most Americans identify themselves as middle class, and under some standards that might be considered accurate. But if you take a kind of literal definition of the middle class, that is being in the middle of the income distribution, then we're talking about some numbers. $50,000, approximately $50,000 is the median income in the United States. Half of us make more than that in our household. Half of households make less than that. And the range around that median, where most of us find ourselves, are between $20,000 and $100,000 per year. So 60% of Americans have a household income in that range. But as I said, surveys show people who make $200,000 a year often self-identify as middle class. But 60% of us do live between $20,000 and $100,000. Is somebody making $20,000 a year and somebody making $100,000 a year in the same economic class? Yeah, there might be significant differences. You notice $100,000 is 5 times the income of $20,000. So there's quite a wide range of incomes within that category. As I said, this is an age of rising economic anxiety. So the question is, why? What's going on? People are concerned about finding jobs. We have an unemployment rate which officially is around between 8 and 9%. But we also have a high degree of underemployment. People who have really good credentials and yet are working at jobs that normally wouldn't call for that level of education, or perhaps are underpaid given their achievements. So we have a lot of people doing temporary jobs. We also have rising debt levels. At least I'm taking a longer term perspective. People have started to cut back since 2007. They've tried to reduce their debt. At the same time, we are a very indebted generation of Americans. Healthcare. People are concerned about their access to healthcare. They're also concerned about the cost of healthcare. More and more people are contributing to their own insurance programs through their employers. And, of course, many of us are still uninsured, and depending on what happens with the Affordable Care Act, people are concerned about access. Housing. Obviously, there's two sides to this. People that don't yet own their own home look at the housing problem as one that houses are too pricey. They cost too much. How will I ever be able to afford one? Perhaps that explains why some people in your generation are graduating from college and moving back home with their parents, at least for a time. And yet other people are concerned that the price of housing is too low. I borrowed $500,000. My home is only worth $400,000. What am I going to do? And this has created, as you are contributed, obviously, to our financial crisis. And taxes, the burden of taxes, as we've talked about all weekend, for many people seems like it's higher than it should be. There's a certain amount of services provided by the government, but a lot of people don't see real value for what the government is withholding. And it's caused some of us to look back to a previous age as a kind of golden age for the middle class, a happy time, a time when all kinds of people could aspire to the simple lifestyle of having not only enough income to feed yourself, to put a roof over your head, but to enjoy some of the finer things in life. A vacation once in a while to Disneyland or something of that nature. Comfortable, secure, where the husband can bring home enough pay so that the wife doesn't have to work if she doesn't want to. And this is kind of what it was like in the 1950s. And people are saying, what happened to that? How did they do it? Why can't we do it? This comparison was addressed in a book written by Elizabeth Warren, who's currently running for the Senate in Massachusetts, but she was formerly a law professor at Harvard University, and she specialized in bankruptcy law. One of the things that she noticed in her practice was that many of the bankruptcies were of parents as opposed to single people. And so she started to look at, some of the pressures on families, families with children in particular. And so she did this comparison, and when she talks about it in the book, her point of this comparison is to show that even now with two incomes in the household, the discretionary income of the household has not increased. And here's how she arrives at that conclusion. You can see for yourself, the income increases dramatically. That is, before expenses, $38,000 compared to $67,000. So having a second spouse should make this family better off. But you can see, even though they spend the same percentage of their income on their mortgage, roughly the same percentage, maybe even a little less on insurance, same percentage on automobiles, there are two things here that go up dramatically when that second person takes a job. One is daycare, and the other is taxes. She doesn't really seem to mind the fact that taxes go up. She doesn't really address that much in her book. Although when I looked at this, that's something that really jumped out to me. A good chunk of that income is taken up by taxes. The $17,000 left over is what you have for not the necessities in life, but some of those luxuries we talked about, the vacation and so forth. Some other issues she raised in the book, or I've taken away from reflecting on it. The role of the homemaker in the 1950s was essentially, well, among other things, a very economic one, a very productive one, because the homemaker provided extremely valuable services. And economists have tried to estimate the value of these services, and some of them have estimated that the value of a full-time homemaker is over $100,000 a year. I don't doubt that. But in any case, these were not explicit costs for the household. These were simply donated services, and they were not taxed. So now, when a woman works outside the home, she may be providing the same kind of services or the same value, the same productivity, but of course now she's going to be taxed on the value of her work. So I think that's a hidden benefit that perhaps previous generations had economically. Another thing that I want to point out, and that Elizabeth Warren points out in her book, is that during times of economic stress, a temporary period of unemployment, for example, or when the family aspired to get something a little extra. You want to take that vacation to Europe? I'm going to get a job for a year, and we're going to apply my earnings to that. In other words, they learned to live on one income. They kept their expenses within that, their routine expenses within that income, and that made the second member of the household able to generate some of these extra things that they needed. We also have to remember, if you go back to that picture, you look at the size of that house, and that family probably only owned one car. And one of the things that's happening in the modern household is people are buying more cars, bigger houses. You notice that the mortgage here, although it's 13% of their current income, it's twice as much as the mortgage back in 1973. So people are buying bigger and better, and that's also a part of what's going on. Now, what about that major breadwinner? What were the circumstances facing the person who went outside the home to seek employment? Well, certainly after World War II, the United States was in an enviable position. We had an incredibly productive economy. We had a comparative advantage in manufacturing. I can't remember the percentages, but we were the world's leading exporter by far. We were the most productive labor force on earth by far. Another thing that was going on at that time was something that sociologists refer to as the Capital Labor Accord. The Capital Labor Accord is a period of peace between management and organized labor. A period when strikes were generally averted, when collective bargaining resulted in substantial gains in worker contracts. Those gains obviously took the form of more generous pensions, more generous types of insurance coverage, higher wages, better working conditions. Now, some people will point to this as a way of benefiting the middle class, and to a certain extent in the short run, I believe it did, but we also have to remember that these promises were just that, promises, and in some ways they were always contingent. Any promise that we're going to pay you a certain amount of money in the future comes with a certain amount of risk and uncertainty. So these pensions that were promised, these very generous, require that the company continue to earn a certain amount of money, continue to grow at a certain rate, that those investments accumulate a certain amount of interest and capital gains and so forth. And we all know that doesn't necessarily happen. As these promises came to mature for the companies that had made them, it often reduced those companies' competitiveness. So for example, U.S. automobile manufacturing still has extremely high labor productivity, but as I think one of our earlier speakers alluded to, the costs of the Detroit 3 automakers, the legacy costs, are much higher than for their international competitors because of these promises they've made to their retired workers. It's also public employee unions in the same way. There are some states that are in fiscal difficulty because they're having a hard time keeping the promises they made. So if you had this promise back in the 1960s, it made you feel wealthier. It meant you didn't have to save for your own retirement. Somebody else was going to take care of that. And that made people feel flush, and obviously they would have increased their spending a little bit as a result. That's not true of this generation. Defined benefit plans are disappearing. 40% of workers were covered under some kind of pension plan back in 1960. Today that's down to 20%. How are your employers helping you save for your retirement? More likely a defined contribution plan where you set aside a certain amount of your paycheck each week and they may match it, but that's a much different kind of thing. When it's coming out of your paycheck, that means it's not available for you to spend on other things. It feels like more pressure. Insurance. When insurance was offered as a benefit, it was very affordable. Our healthcare spending was very low on a per capita basis, and it was fairly easy for the employer to pick that up. But of course, as healthcare costs have risen dramatically, that's become a burden on our competitiveness as well, and employers are cutting back on the amount of insurance that they're willing to offer. And so many of you are paying a much higher percentage of your insurance costs than previous generations. The other advantage, I think, that used to exist for people your age was the entry-level barriers to a middle-class wage were pretty small in terms of the skills that you had to acquire or the credentials that you had to acquire. They were relatively minimal. And I think this is a function of the technology available at the time. The technology that was used was cutting edge, best in the world. Our manufacturing had no peer. But in order to operate that manufacturing, it took fairly basic skills, a fairly short period of training to bring workers up to speed. And this definitely made it a little bit easier for people who, might not know, might not be self-directed. They might drift around a little bit in high school or college without really fighting. But even though they might be a slow starter, they could jump into that when they were ready. Okay? Obviously, this is one of the things that's not true, I think, for your generation. The skill requirements, the credential requirements have changed. The technology has changed. And you have to have a little bit more planning, a little bit more direction at an earlier age to acquire those skills, to get those credentials, to get into that kind of career. So here's a slide that shows how much difference credentials make for people. And what I want to show you in this case is the college degree is the blue line. If you have a college degree, you start working a little bit later in life, and that's why the blue line starts a little bit further to the right on the scale at age 21 or 22 instead of age 18. And so the person who starts working immediately out of high school has a slight advantage, but that break-even point comes pretty early in life. By age 32, the earnings of the slow starter, the college graduate, have caught up and have begun to surpass. And by age 65, at the age of retirement, it's become a substantial advantage. In this particular scenario, about $400,000 worth of additional lifetime income. Now, as students in your generation look at these historical trends, it makes sense to pay $20,000, $30,000, $100,000 for a college degree. In present value terms, you'll still come out ahead. But I think some students have not looked deeply into what kind of college degree, and that has created some problems. In addition, because of the expense of pursuing the degree, many students have gone into debt without fully realizing what kind of burden that might place on their future finances. So credentials pay. It's worth pursuing credentials. This is something that people in prior generations weren't as knowledgeable about and weren't as concerned about. It was possible to attain a middle-class lifestyle, much more possible without a college degree. Now, I'm going to backpedal a little bit on what I just said about it being worthwhile to get a college degree. I think in some ways it is worthwhile to get the credential because it will open doors. In another way, I'm not really sure that it's worth getting the credential because the fact that it gets you the job, but in many cases it's not necessary to do the job, I think is a problem for our economy. This is a help wanted ad in a South Carolina newspaper. I used to work in a warehouse myself when I was a college student during the summer in Ann Arbor, Domino's. And my manager didn't have a college degree. He didn't have any college education. He started as a worker just like I did, working there part-time at first, then full-time, showed he had a little bit of skill and initiative, learned how the warehouse worked, and he was promoted to warehouse manager. And I really don't see why he should be forced to go $50,000 into debt and sacrifice 4 years of his earnings in order to apply for a job like that. So I think to a certain extent we are experiencing credential inflation. As more and more people pursue the college degree, employers are looking to that college degree as a filter. I've got 400 applicants for this position. Let me just look at those with a college degree first. And it certainly does indicate, something about the quality of those applicants, no doubt about it. But it doesn't necessarily contribute to their effectiveness on the job. Another, I think, wasteful credential is the occupational license. In many cases, the occupational license is not really essential to being effective on the job. It's more of a way to limit competition for those that already are doing that particular service. And the occupational licenses have exploded since 1960. It used to be that only 5%, excuse me, 5% of workers needed an occupational license to do what they did. Excuse me. It's over 30% today. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, this is a person learning to braid hair. And there's 1,500 hours required to get your cosmetology license in the state of Georgia. And if you try to braid hair without a cosmetology license, then you can pay thousands of dollars in fines and be subject to arrest. You cannot braid hair without a license in the state of Georgia, and there are many other states that have similar regulations. Where did these regulations come from? Well, it turns out there were immigrants from the West Indies coming into the United States where this is a traditional hairstyle, where they were highly skilled, and they were opening up little businesses. And they were braiding hair. And they were competition for the beauty salons and the licensed cosmetologists, and so they put this barrier in their path. These occupational licenses, in many cases, are a barrier to self-employment. And during economic recessions like this, self-employment for many people is their best option for finding work quickly and achieving economic independence. We shouldn't be putting barriers in their path. This is by no means an unusual example. There are many others. In the state of Oklahoma, you cannot buy a casket from an unlicensed dealer. You have to buy one from a licensed funeral director. As a result, people pay about $400 more for their caskets in Oklahoma. This is always passed in the name of protecting the consumer, but motivated, I think, by protecting the existing workers from competition. What does protect the consumer? Back in the day when only 5% of jobs were covered by an occupational license, how did consumers survive? How come we weren't plagued with bad hair days back in 1960s? It's because in a competitive market economy, if you get a bad hair day from your barber, you switch barbers. And that system, over time, generally produces a better result and more opportunity. All right. As I alluded to earlier, the college credential by itself is not necessarily enough anymore to gain access to a middle-class lifestyle. A lot depends on, the difference essentially between your skills and your credentials. There are many good jobs which, for which there's a shortage of workers, which pay a very substantial wage, and yet we're told that Americans can't find these people in America. With so many Americans out of work, there are employers that have advertisements that are not answered with a qualified employee month after month. And part of the reason is because technology has changed. This is a modern manufacturing plant, and you can see this worker who's operating this machinery. His responsibilities are for monitoring the software, for making sure within very tight tolerances that it doesn't deviate from where it's supposed to be, making those adjustments. There's a lot of hours of training that goes into this. This person becomes highly skilled and highly coveted by other manufacturers, and so they earn a fairly reasonable wage. But you can't just take a high school student off the street and develop that kind of skill level. Here's a quote from Tyler Cohen, economist at George Mason University, about the engineering shortage in the U.S. And you can see here, 89,000 students in the visual and performing arts. They have college degrees. Why visual and performing arts? Probably because it's more fun than engineering. Maybe it's a little easier than engineering. I have personal experience with this. I had a roommate in college who majored in theater. Then he went out to California and got his master's in theater. Yeah. He paid $40,000 for a master's degree in theater performance. Okay? I remember conversations with him. Should I do what I love, or should I try and make money? Well, he decided he's going to do what he loves, and that means he's not making money. Okay? I remember many of the weekend I spent in the library studying for my economics classes, where he spent basically in social activities having a lot of fun. It's kind of the ant and the grasshopper story. Now, it may be that there's lots of money available in computer science, math, chemical engineering, and people are doing what they like. But there's also a lot more competition today for college students because there's a lot of money to be made in finance, in economics. There's a lot of money to be made in other fields. So if you were really smart back in 1960 and you had the wherewithal to go to college, you're much more likely to go into an engineering program than you were to go to law school or to go into finance, something like that. But now some of our best and brightest are being attracted by some of these other majors. Others are trying to do what they love. And what that means for these particular fields is that there's not enough graduates. And of the graduates that do exist, many of them are not of the quality that they used to be. This is the results of a survey done by the Manufacturing Institute. They discovered, after surveying employers around the country, that there are over 600,000 jobs that go unfilled each year because of a lack of skilled workers. And here's a quote from a company in Michigan. People in Michigan think of us as a manufacturing state, and certainly we're part of that Rust Belt. and that's disappearing. But the fact is, there's still solid manufacturing base here in Michigan, but they are struggling to hire people. The skills of the Michigan labor force apparently are not up to the task. In fact, there was another study done at Harvard University by Michael Porter when he looked at U.S. competitiveness. He did a study where he surveyed 7,000 Harvard Business School alumni, and all of them with some decision-making authority within their own companies. And he asked them, if you were to expand your company, would you do it in the United States or somewhere else? And the vast majority of them said somewhere else. And if you look at the reasons given, the lack of skills in the United States was number 3. We just seem to have dropped the ball on developing the right. It's not as though we're not spending money on education. It's not as though we're not achieving a certain amount of credentials, but it's just that we are not achieving the skills that are demanded in the workplace. When I was young, I was encouraged to find my vocation, not just find a job. I was encouraged to find my vocation. My vocation was explained to me as the intersection of 2 things. It was the intersection of my great passions, what I loved, what I cared about, and the world's great need. Now, I'm passionate about golf. I love to play it. I'm looking forward to next week when I get to play a little bit of golf with Dr. Nash's brother, Dave. But the fact is, nobody would pay me to play golf. Nobody. I'm not good enough for that. So I had to find something that the world really did value. And so I do a heck of a lot more economics than I do golf. Okay? And that's what having a vocation really means. It's not doing what you love, although it is loving what you do. It's loving what you do that is also very useful to other people. And I think that's what we have to communicate, and hopefully at an early age, to people who are about to spend $100,000 on an education credential. These, of course, manufacturing jobs are not the only jobs that are hard to fill. Turns out there's shortages in all kinds of skills. Manpower Incorporated did a survey, the toughest jobs for employers to fill, to find good people. Now, they may find applicants, but finding applicants is not the same as finding good, reliable, skilled employees. So these are some of the trades that are just hard to fill. Electricians, plumbers, nurses, technical sales representatives. A lot of people know how to sell stuff, but there are certain kinds of things that require a certain level of technical expertise as well, and those people are hard to come by. Would you believe truck drivers? Why do you have trouble filling truck driver jobs? Well, there is a certain amount of skill involved, but it's also the working conditions are unpleasant. You have to be away from your family, on the road, long hours. It's tiring. So there are actually more jobs listed than this, but there are many jobs in the United States. But there is currently a mismatch between the skills of applicants and the needs of employers. So my question is, why do we have such a mismatch? I already alluded to some of the reasons. I'm not sure what's wrong with our educational model, but it clearly is not producing the right kind of results. I suggest we could look around at some other countries, perhaps how they do things. We heard a talk from Maurice McTighe earlier this weekend where he talked about how New Zealand reformed their educational system, looking at the results that they wanted and figuring out how to do that properly. I think we should be doing that. Right now, I think we're doing things in a certain way because that's the way we've always done it. And there are certain people that are heavily invested in the status quo, and they are firmly opposed to any substantial change. But substantial change is needed. Worker preferences. Obviously, in the case of engineering, we have intelligent people choosing to study something else. That's understandable. Nothing you can do about that. But I also think, to a certain extent, perhaps people are not necessarily well informed about what kinds of careers are available, what kinds of skills they need to achieve the lifestyle they aspire to. So I think, partly it's workers simply being lazy to a certain extent, not taking the initiative to really pursue, or maybe parents not taking the initiative with their children to help them discover their path early in life. The bottom line, though, is I think we're spending way too much money on credentials and perhaps not investing nearly enough in the development of skills. Here's an example of what I'm talking about when I say our educational model is inefficient. You can see how spending has risen on a per-pupil basis after adjusting for inflation from $4,000 in 1970 to $9,000 in 2005. At $9,000 per student, 12 years of compulsory education, we should be producing better outcomes. But if you look at the achievement level at each age, at least as measured by these reading scores, you haven't seen any real advance. So we're spending more for less or the same amount. The cost of higher education has been rising rapidly as well. And you can see here that the public four-year schools, their tuition rates have been rising the fastest. It used to be that a state college or university was relatively affordable to most families, and now even that is becoming much more expensive. The private four-year colleges have not raised their tuition rates as fast. Why do you suppose that is? Endowments will explain part of it. And we also have to look at the fact that private colleges, especially colleges that are looking to expand enrollment, they have to be concerned about cost because there's a little bit more price competition going on. They're not subsidized. If the students don't want to pay that premium for a private education, they'll choose a state school gladly. So in competing with the state schools, which offer tuition rates that are heavily discounted by the taxpayers, they've been forced to keep their costs low in order to compete. And obviously endowments and other private assistance as well. Okay. So we know the cost of education is going up. But the question is, what's happening? Is it demand side? Is it supply side? What's going on? I think in this field, as in any other field, when you break the connection between cost and benefits, when you have somebody receiving the benefit and a third party bearing the cost, that you're going to get less price competition, more inflation. I think that's true of healthcare, and I think it's true of education. Education has been heavily subsidized by third parties. The endowments, the taxpayer subsidies, scholarships and so forth. Very few students actually pay the full cost of their education. Well, that means if you're not paying the full cost of your education, that colleges are not going to compete on the basis of cost. There's not as much innovation directed towards keeping costs low. Instead, colleges compete in terms of what students want from their college degree. So, for example, one thing I've noticed in recent years is how much money colleges have spent on their libraries and their cafeterias. Why is that? Is that really affecting the outcome? In the age of the internet, I'm not even sure that colleges should be investing in huge, expensive libraries when, frankly, you've got a better library than I had during college. You've got it right there on your iPad. But the fact is, we are investing these millions of dollars in cafeterias? Why? Because when parents come through on the tour, this is what they see. These are the library. Here's the cafeteria. And isn't it beautiful? And isn't the food delicious? And, of course, I'm not talking about Northwood in this case. I'm just generalizing. although Northwood food is delicious. It's something similar to what was happening in the old days when the regulations limited what airlines could charge, and because there was no price competition between airlines and the routes were strictly controlled by the Federal Aviation Administration, airlines would compete on the basis of which airline had the best food. Can you imagine? Now you're lucky if you get a bag of pretzels and a soda. But in those days, they would actually compete on the quality of food, the room within the cabin, how attractive is the stewardess, all these kinds of irrelevant things as far as getting you from point A to point B. As soon as that was deregulated, you introduced price competition, and airlines started to figure out that paying customers don't really care that much about those other things, that they'd gladly be willing to sacrifice some of that if they could cut $200 off the cost of a ticket. And so airlines have found that they can keep costs low by eliminating irrelevant expenses. And I think colleges could do the same thing if there was an incentive to do that. I think the same thing is true of healthcare as well. Housing. Housing is obviously more expensive now than it was back in the 1970s or 60s or whatever you want to call the golden age of the middle class. For many students, they question whether or not they will ever own their own home. It does seem to be beyond their reach. One of the things that was done to try and correct the situation is to reduce the lending standards, to increase the ability of individuals with little savings or with poor credit to obtain a house. That didn't work too well. Led to a housing bubble. People were buying houses because they expected, as unlike the stock market, they thought that housing prices only went up. You see what that led to? This is also an area in which government has been heavily involved, at least since the 1930s. They've been subsidizing home ownership and increasing the demand for housing. One of the biggest ways they subsidize it is through the tax deductibility of mortgage interest. And because mortgage interest is tax deductible, the price of houses go up. If you get to write off $5,000 from your tax bill because of mortgage interest deductions, does that mean that government program actually saved you $5,000? Right, you pay it off in the purchase price of the house. It's something consumers take into account. The present value of those tax savings find their way into the value of the home. Realtors and real estate developers benefit a lot more from that tax deductibility than homeowners do. We have a system of rationing public education. It would be fantastic if all our schools were of equal quality, in which case it wouldn't matter which neighborhood you lived in, you could be fairly certain that you're doing the best you can for your child. But the reality is, it does depend on which neighborhood you live in. And because of that, there is competition to get into certain neighborhoods, into the best school districts. And this is something Elizabeth Warren talked about in her book, The Two-Income Trap. One of the reasons she thinks that parents are more likely to declare bankruptcy than non-parents. It's because, she says, many of them are trying to get an address. And it's a bit of an arms race. And the reason for this, of course, is because we're rationing access to quality education by address. It is separate and unequal, in my opinion. And finally, another cause for high home prices is low interest rates. Now, low interest rates are something realtors love, car dealers love them, borrowers love them, investors not so much. But the fact is that a low interest rate really contributes to the affordability of housing. So if you look at, supply side factor. On the supply side, if you look at where the housing bubble occurred, you'll see that these were the districts or the areas with the most strict zoning requirements, basically anti-growth in their orientation, or maybe requirements that require every single family home to be on a certain amount of land, certain acreage, and so you can have lower density housing because of these restrictions. I know in the subdivision I lived in a few years ago, I had a new home built for myself, and the developer told me he could only fit so many homes into that property. Why is that? Well, because it turns out the roads he had to construct for that subdivision had to allow 2 fire trucks to pass each other going 40 miles an hour comfortably in that street. Now, 2 fire trucks passing each other at 40 miles an hour going in opposite directions, first of all, that would never happen on my street. It was a curvy, windy little subdivision. They couldn't go 40 miles an hour down, but he had to meet a certain width level that some bureaucrat had decided was wide enough to let that happen. That means less land available for housing. Point is that housing has become more expensive, but it varies from locality to locality. This is one of the reasons why places like Houston, for example, did not experience the same degree of a housing boom and bust as places like San Francisco. So I want to show what's happened to home prices compared to what's happened to income. And this is median income in the blue line and housing prices in the red line. And you can see that housing prices, like college, education, like healthcare, have risen more rapidly than income, putting a new home, in some respects, further and further out of reach. You can see the effects of the boom and bust. Even after the bust, housing prices are a historically high ratio compared to the median income. They're still unaffordable for many people. On the other hand, once you take into account the interest rates that we're experiencing, this may explain it. If you look at interest rates and what that does to a mortgage payment, the mortgage payment as a percentage of the median income has actually been declining for some time. It actually peaked in 1980 and has been coming down more or less ever since. So in some ways, the low interest rate has made up for the rise in home prices, or maybe caused the rise in home prices. Healthcare costs are a third area, along with housing and education, where prices have been rising much more rapidly than the general rate of inflation. And you can see that in 1960, Americans only spent 5% of their incomes on health insurance or other forms of health care. And by the year 2000, that was over 15%. It's closer to 17% now. So it's more than tripled as a share of our budget. And yet most people don't feel that. Most people feel like, well, my parents had health care, I've got health care. What you don't understand is you've got 3 times as much, at least measured by spending. And I think to a certain extent, that spending is justified. Unlike what I said about education spending, where the results have been relatively flat, the results in health care have been dramatic. Health care quality is dramatically improved over where it was 5 years ago, let alone 30 years ago. So I think to a certain extent some of that additional spending has been justified. And as you learned in here from a previous speaker this weekend, the United States, because of its investment in healthcare, is the world's leading producer of new therapies, new drugs. It's very innovative. Okay? So to a certain extent, I think we're getting what we pay for here. But then again, to another extent, I think this story is similar to what's happening in those other sectors, that much more often than there used to be, somebody else is paying the bill. And because they're paying the bill, we are making decisions that our parents probably would have made differently, or our grandparents. In the case of my mother, I have a dramatic example. The last day of her life cost $50,000. She was dying. We knew that. We had her at home. She was comfortable, but she was showing signs of distress. Unfortunately, she was in the last stages of brain cancer, so we took her to the hospital. She was in the hospital for a little more than 24 hours before she died, and the bill was $56,000. Wow. In some ways, that's unconscionable. But the fact is, it didn't cost us a dime out of pocket. My dad, a former high school teacher for Ann Arbor Public Schools, has great health insurance. And great health insurance is one that's defined as one that will generally pay for whatever you want to use. And it did. The problem with this, of course, is that it's crowding out other forms of compensation, because in America, we're providing health care through our employers, at least access to health insurance, most of us. Those employers only have so much money they're willing to allocate towards a particular budget line, and if you are that budget line, and you're costing them more and more every year for your health insurance, what does that imply about what they're willing to pay you in terms of other benefits or cash? And this is what's happening. You see the growth in wages in recent years. This is since the mid-1990s. Wages have been growing more slowly. You can see even some negative growth there at the end. And yet compensation has been growing consistently. It's just taken the form of health insurance rather than wages. Okay. Now at this point, I want to take a short break. So in 10 minutes, I'll resume this lecture, and it's about 9:30 now, so we'll resume at 9:40. Good morning. Yeah.
People now, what they're getting is the Cadillac, or before they used to get a Ford, because you're getting service now that it's miraculous.
It is great stuff.
So people complain about the cost, but they've chosen to go from a lowly Ford when I was a kid.
Okay, welcome back from your break, everybody. Can I have your attention? All right, at this point, rather than save your questions till the end, I'd rather you ask your questions now while it's fresh in your mind. Does anybody have any comments or questions about what we've talked about so far? Yes.
Speaking of terms of like education in like elementary and middle school, you prefer public education or private education, and why?
Question is, do I think private education is preferable to public education at the lower level, elementary school? Although it's tempting to go outside my expertise and answer that question based on personal opinion, I'm not going to do that. I'm not an expert on that, so I couldn't tell you. What I can tell you from a general economics perspective is that generally competition leads to higher standards over time. And I think that would be true in education as well as in any other discipline or any other industry. And I think right now the fact that we have one provider, the public schools, which is able to, I guess, force its students more or less to choose their particular school and have somebody else bear the cost, so there's no competition on the basis of price. There's very little competition on the basis of quality. I do think that that is a problem with our current system. So I would like to see something more like what Maurice Mateague was talking about the other day, where you put private and public schools on an equal basis in terms of funding. You might do that with school vouchers or some other method, but the point is, I think they need to compete on an equal basis and then let the parents decide. And it's the desires of the parents, I think, that will lead to rising standards in both schools. Yes? Well, again, you're asking questions beyond my expertise, but No Child Left Behind, I'm against to just on principle, because I would prefer to see the Department of Education abolished at the federal level. It's a fairly recent development in our federal government. The founders saw no reason to have a Department of Education. When the contract with America was written by the 104th Congress in 1994. They promised they were going to get rid of the Department of Education. This was during the middle of the Clinton administration. Well, when we elected a Republican to office, rather than get rid of the Department of Education, it expanded in every possible way. The number of employees, the budget, the amount of regulation, and so I guess my answer, I know that's not the question you asked, but in a general way, I would prefer to see that education policy handled entirely by the states and not by the federal government, period. Yes?
You said that colleges can cut relevant expenses, and then you started applying the cafeterias where they buy big libraries for some of those expenses. But if that's what the students, or the consumers, want, how can you justify that that's not where the money should be going?
The problem here is that the students aren't paying for what they want. And when you give somebody what they want and charge somebody else, that's an inefficient allocation of resources. So my point here is that in all those industries I talked about, in many cases, somebody else is picking up a substantial part of the cost. And that's why it's rising more and more rapidly. Now, even though on an individual basis, it may feel like this is helping you, when you take into account the fact that somebody is paying for it, okay? Probably you, in the form of higher taxes, higher debt. It's not a good deal, okay? Example, you had dessert at every meal, that is lunch and dinner, while you were here. Have you seen the price of those desserts? Do you think you would have had dessert at every meal had you had a menu and were spending your own money on a case-by-case basis? Do you think it was an efficient allocation of education dollars to give you desserts? Or could we have spent that money differently? Now, I'm going to take the blame for that, although to a certain extent my hands are tied by custom and so forth. But again, you buy textbooks that I choose for you. I have no idea what they cost. Do you? And yet you do not make the choice, except whether or not to avoid buying the book altogether. Imagine if you guys were making the choice. If I charge you $200 for one of those books on the back table, say, this is education, you need this, how many of you would say, oh, $200? Let me see. The reason that you have access to those books at $10 is because you are buying them with your own money. And the reason that you don't have the same options when it comes to textbook is your professors are deciding what to buy. And so what are publishers doing? They're building all kinds of bells and whistles into the content that are really irrelevant to the outcome. And it's making textbooks more and more expensive. Because like the college students touring the campus in the, their senior year of high school, they're looking, and the professors look at the text and say, wow, that is really cool. Oh, look at this edition. It's 1 year newer than the old edition. And, so what? If the content hasn't really changed, so what? I think inflation in certain areas is a function of who's paying the bill. And I guess that's my answer to your question. It's wonderful to want things. I want a Corvette, but I'm not going to buy one on my way home today. Unless you want to pay for half of it. Yes?
Talk about the percentage of people that are underqualified for certain jobs, but there's always this percentage of people that are overqualified for jobs. What do you think their motivation is to go to college and get a degree when they can't get the job that they really want?
Well, can you give me an example of something you have in mind? Are you talking about a PhD driving a taxi or something like that? Historically, college has been more of a consumption item than an investment. I think it's only recently when you have more and more, a higher percentage of the population going to college, that it's been looked at more of as an investment. And I think the classical approach to education was it's just a means of developing yourself as a human being, developing your intellectual qualities and your desire to experience beauty and truth. And so there may still be a substantial number of people who would go to college, whether, in fact, I know some people like this, who pursue education because they love it. And it's not about getting the career. Okay, I'm actually going to ask you to hold your questions now until the next break. So I'm going to continue this presentation. So far, I've been talking about the middle class as being dependent on a person's income. But there historically has been a different way of looking at the middle class, a way of looking at it as a culture or as a set of character traits. And the word that we use to describe this idea is bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is the middle class, sociologically speaking, that developed in Europe during the Middle Ages. The word bourgeoisie, or bourgeois, means town dweller. So these are the ethics or the culture of the cities of medieval Europe. It's distinct from, well, I'm sorry. So when we think about middle class, we've been talking about what they earn as a way to distinguish between middle class and other kinds of individuals. But historically, it's also been important to identify them by how they have achieved that living standard. And typically, the bourgeoisie were seen as a class of people that lived by their wits. In the countryside, land was owned by the nobility. The farmers, the peasants, the serfs, they worked the land. They didn't actually own it. And their level of income was at best subsistence level, enough to get by, enough to survive. They lived in homes that they themselves typically did not own. So they depended to a large extent, they were economically dependent on the nobles in whatever policies they had, the rents they charged, however they were treated made a huge difference. But with the middle class in the cities, their lifestyle was dependent on what they could earn. And so many of them developed something special. You don't get paid a premium wage for a common skill. So you develop a specialized trade, you get involved in looking for entrepreneurial opportunities, you live by your wits, and you're able to, because you have developed your talents in a way that's special, you are able to not only feed yourself and your family, but also enjoy a little higher standard of living, some of the luxuries and comforts, not perhaps as much as the nobility, but certainly more than the common peasant. The other thing that would distinguish this group is the values they would hold, and it's of a piece. If you want to get ahead in the town, if you want to develop a skill, it takes hard work. It takes a certain amount of investment in yourself. It takes a certain amount of judgment and awareness. Where are the opportunities in this town? What are the problems people face that I know how to fix? And so there's a kind of initiative that develops. Also, who's going to take care of me if for some reason I'm incapacitated or if things don't work out as I planned? I better have a little bit of savings. And boy, wouldn't it have been nice if I could have started a little higher on the ladder? That's what I want to do for my kids. I know if I could have started with a little bit of property, I could have done well. And I want them to start with a little bit. And it's an idea of improving your living conditions and that of your family and that of your community. So we're going to talk about this in more detail now. I think it's these bourgeois values that are part of the pressure right now that's on the middle class. I think for a number of reasons they've been declining. Here's a description of the bourgeois culture by Willem Röpke, one of my favorite economists, a German economist who objected to the way the Nazis were running Germany, ended up being a refugee in Switzerland, and one of the founders of the Mount Pelerin Society, along with Orville Watts, as Tim Nash told you yesterday. But in any case, Willem Röpke, he wrote this book called The Humane Economy, which is one of my favorite economics books, and I recommend it to you. Basically, He said the bourgeois class is essential to the proper operation of a market economy. We talk about capitalism, but capitalism without a bourgeois class is inconceivable. At least to Rupke, inconceivable to Marx. Marx had contempt for the bourgeois, but he also had for the bourgeoisie, but he also had a lot of admiration for their economic accomplishments, for the progress that had resulted from bourgeoisie culture. So here we have a picture of the way life was for the vast majority of Europeans, let's say in the year 1200. And you can see the peasants, and this, what I like about this painting is that the noble, he's probably commissioned this tapestry, and he's probably meant to be represented here as a kind of benevolent director of things. And the nobles, they're the governing class. And they have a certain amount of responsibility for the welfare of the peasants under their dominion. And the church was heavily involved in this as well, and made sure that the rule of the nobility was somewhat humane, that if there was poverty, sickness, there were certain obligations of the lord to the serf and reciprocal obligations of the serf to the master. But you can imagine the kind of work ethic that you might develop if you're actually being told what to do on property that you yourself don't own, and knowing that your children will pretty much live the same kind of life that you, your father, and your grandfather going back to time immemorial have lived. You would lose a sense of progress. You would lose a sense of purpose. And so if you left the farm and went to the city, life was different. There's a saying in Germany that developed during the Middle Ages called Stadtluft macht frei. Stadtluft means city air. And this saying means city air makes you free. Or city air means freedom. And it actually had some historical basis. In some parts of Germany, if a peasant left his particular village and went into the market city for a certain period of time, his master could call him back if he was needed. You got to get back here, we need you to harvest the crops. But that had a time limit. If he did not call you back within a year, then he lost his right to call you back. And that means if you lived in the city for a year, you became a free agent, no longer tied to a particular profession or to a particular piece of land. And now you could make your own way in the world and find your vocation. Stadtluft macht frei. As a result, a certain culture developed within this class of free people, a culture of freedom in which, I won't insult your intelligence by reading it to you. I'll let you read it yourself. Can you see why these values would have been the things that a bourgeois, a member of the bourgeoisie would teach to his children? The independence of this particular class of people, these individuals, meant individual responsibility, and individual responsibility means you need to develop certain attitudes, certain virtues, if you're going to get by in life. So we've been using this word middle class, but I think we've been using it in terms of income alone. I want to emphasize the fact that the bourgeoisie are considered middle class in more than one sense. First of all, there is income. They, unlike the peasants, were able to achieve a little higher standard of living. But they were also middle in another sense. They were the intermediaries between other individuals. They were the market makers. They were the traders. And they were the ones who borrowed and loaned money and, sold, if maybe purchased goods in one town and took them to another town, the merchants, the bankers, the financiers, the people that made the market work, the middleman. And they were middle in another sense, in terms of prestige. It wasn't particularly honorable to be a peasant or a serf. Labor was not, manual labor was not looked on as something particularly dignified. But what the bourgeoisie did was something beyond manual labor. It was using your head. And this was somehow more honorable, respectable. People looked at the talents and recognized, hey, not everybody can do this. Oh, isn't that person clever? In fact, people would even be suspicious sometimes about how clever these entrepreneurs and members of the bourgeoisie, how they might use their intellectual abilities to obtain more than their fair share. Here's an example of the mixed feelings with which the merchant class was held in those days. This is an excerpt from a play that was written, I think, in the 1400s. And in this case, the scene is a king has heard complaints about a particular merchant. He's charging prices that are too high. And so the king has called the merchant into the court to explain himself, to justify it. And the merchant in his defense says, I say I am useful to the king, and to the ealdormen, and to the rich, and to all people. I send my ship with my merchandise, and sail over the sea-like places, and sell my things, and buy dear things which are not produced in this land, and I bring them back to you here with great danger over the sea. And sometimes I suffer shipwreck, with the loss of all my things, scarcely escaping myself. So the king asks him, what kinds of things, or what things do you bring? Skins, silks, costly gems, gold, various garments, pigment, wine, oil, ivory, orichalcus, copper and tin, silver, glass, and such like. Does anybody know what orichalcus is? It makes me think this merchant actually may have been dishonest, actually. Orichalcus is a special gem that's found only in the lost city of Atlantis. So he's probably passing some ordinary rock off as some special gem from Atlantis. In any case, the rest of this is true enough. But why is the king suspicious? With the next question, we see the reason. Will you sell your things here as you brought them here? He's asking, have you transformed them? Have you processed them? Is the gold that you're selling here the same as the gold you bought over there? Because there was a theory of the time that said that all value comes from labor. If you have not labored on this particular item, you have not added any value to it, what right have you to charge more to me than you paid for it yourself? That was thought to be some kind of injustice. So, of course, the merchant is trying to say, well, okay, I haven't changed anything. But if I didn't charge a higher price, what would my labor benefit me? I will sell them dearer here than I bought them there, that I may get some profit to feed me, my wife, and children. So it was a struggle during the Middle Ages for the bourgeois class to gain respect, to overcome suspicion. And I think, honestly, this is a never-ending struggle. It is clear today that people are suspicious about the middleman, the money makers, the speculators, and so forth, and don't necessarily recognize their function in society. And to a certain extent, that's what this seminar is about, to help us understand the role of people engaged in business enterprise and the significance of profit. Now, obviously, some of these became very rich. We think of middle class as somebody that is of relatively modest means. But take somebody like Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, the prototypical American, self-made man. I think he was the 22nd son of the 22nd son. I don't remember, but low on the pecking order within his own family, let's say. And he arrived, he says in his autobiography, on the streets of Philadelphia as a teenager with a couple of loaves of bread and little else. And he took his mind, which was incredibly bright, and discovered ways of being useful in the city of Philadelphia that made him eventually one of the richest men in America. He was fabulously wealthy by the time he died by the standards of the day. But throughout his life, you'd have to say he was bourgeois. He is the peddler of bourgeois values in America. If you go back to the educational materials that your great-grandparents would have studied, they probably read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. It's kind of like a self-help book for the middle class. Here's how you arrive penniless and make a fortune. It's that attitude. You can do it too. What about this guy? He was also fabulously wealthy by the standards of his day. Was he bourgeois? What do you think? It doesn't fit him as well because, for one thing, he was a slaveholder, he was a warrior, and a statesman. We think of George Washington more as a member of the governing class, even though he wasn't technically nobility. He was a huge landholder. He had slaves on his estate, which he managed, and he served his country in battle, and he eventually served his country as its head of state. This is not fitting comfortably in with our understanding of what the bourgeoisie, what their role is in society. Okay. So it's not wealth that tells us the difference between these two men, because in terms of wealth, they are in the same class, I think. Now, I'm not saying George Washington wasn't virtuous. I think he was definitely among our most virtuous presidents and somebody I admire very much. But I also admire Benjamin Franklin for, I guess, a different set of virtues, or at least a more developed set of certain virtues, some of which have been described in a great book by Deirdre McCloskey. And the book is called The Bourgeois Virtues, Ethics for an Age of Commerce. I just want to describe some of them to you. He tried to frame them in terms of the classical virtues. Prudence has always been considered a virtue. Prudence, making the right judgment in the right circumstances. For a bourgeois, that means buying low and selling high. If you're going to make a profit, you got to know what your business is, how it works, make sure that you spend less than what's coming in. But he also says, in addition, you need the prudence to trade rather than invade, to calculate the consequences, to pursue the good with competence. The second virtue he talks about is justice. Justice, which insists on private property honestly acquired. To the bourgeois, private property is not theft, as Marx called it. It's not something to be suspicious about. It's certainly not something to be jealous of. It's something that you say to your neighbor, well done. What skill or what useful thing did you do for your community to justify your acquisition of so much property? And it's something they understood they could acquire themselves if they worked hard enough or developed their talents to the extent. Courage, obviously. To venture on new ways of business, courage to overcome the fear of change, to bear defeat, even unto bankruptcy. Courteous to new ideas, to wake up next morning and face fresh work with a clear sense of purpose. Northwood has as one of its student outcomes lifelong learning. It has on its this is part of our code of ethics, this courage to undertake risks and enterprise. And many of our students do end up taking risks and becoming owners of their own business. But in any case, this idea of being interested in new ideas and open to new ways of doing things, that's a hallmark of the bourgeois culture. I'm not going to go through all the virtues. Hope is one I want to emphasize here because I think it's relevant, especially considering the way I began this lecture. Talked about the economic anxiety and the insecurity. How should we feel about being born in an interesting age? Hopeful. We can do something about it. There's an optimism which is considered a virtue among the bourgeois, to imagine a better future, to transcend your present circumstances, because you, as a human being, can use your mind and your talents to create that vision. Temperance. I've saved this one for last because, as you'll see in a few moments, I think this is the one that's most directly observable. We're losing it. Temperance, to save and accumulate. The temperance to educate yourself in business and life, to listen to the customer, to resist the temptation to cheat, and to ask quietly whether there might be a compromise. Temperance means not going to an extreme of laziness or workaholism, but doing things in a balanced way, to do what the right amount for your family, the right amount for your employer, the right amount of wages for your employees, to find out how you are going to put your life in balance. The right amount of savings for the future, the right amount of spending on the present. Another way of describing temperance, at least as it relates to finances, is to use the word thrift. And thrift has been considered, in some cases, a vice. Charles Dickens made some wonderful character sketches in his novels, and one of the most memorable, of course, is Ebenezer Scrooge. Ebenezer Scrooge took the virtue of thrift to an extreme, and in doing so made it a vice. He took it from something that was in balance and took it out of balance. Saved too much, spent too little. Another memorable character from Dickens, Mr. Micawber. How many of you know him? Micawber has this, he's a beloved character. Unlike Scrooge, everybody loves Micawber. But Micawber also has a vice. He spends too much and saves too little. Now, one of the redeeming qualities he has is he recognizes this weakness in himself, and he admits it. And he, in fact, he gives advice to David Copperfield, the young man you see in the picture, and he says this famous quote to him. "My other piece of advice, Copperfield," said Mr. Micawber, "you know. Annual income £20, annual expenditure 1996, result, happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20 ought and six, result, misery." We're talking about a 12-cent difference in your spending. That's the difference between happiness and misery. It's the right spot. It's temperance with respect to your finances. Micawber lacked it. Scrooge lacked it. But the bourgeois saw it as something worth pursuing, worth teaching, and a character trait that was honorable. So, are you bourgeois? Let's test yourself here. Which of these two statements, if you honestly evaluate them, best describes your attitude towards work and thrift? How many of you would say, you know what, looking at that, quite honestly, I would have to say that first statement is closer to where I'm at? You're not bourgeois. If you chose the second statement, raise your hand. You're lying. No, just kidding. If that is something that can really be said of you, then I see no reason for you to have any anxiety about your future. Because it is this attitude which will make your future. It is this way of looking at the world which leads to success and to a meaningful life, which is the most important part of success. Now, sociologically speaking, this culture, this middle class, is essential to a free society, not only to a prosperous economy in the sense of material rewards, but also a society where individual responsibility and freedom is respected and honored. And therefore, the middle class becomes, or the bourgeois class, becomes the great defenders of economic freedom, of private property, freedom of contract. When we start to lose our middle class, if in fact it is true that the the middle class is disappearing, or under so much pressure that they lose their entrepreneurial spirit. If that were to be true, then I would be in great fear for the future of liberty in this country, because the middle class have the most at stake here. We talked in here about the golden age of the middle class, the post-war period, but I'm not sure that was the golden age of the middle class. Because I think as you look at the incomes of people, which were rising, and there's no doubt about it, more and more people were getting those little pink houses and the car in the driveway and so forth. But the fact is, in terms of acquiring the culture, there was a disconnect between, in some cases, the economic advances and the cultural values. It wasn't necessarily something that I was doing in the old-fashioned way, by developing myself as a person. Here's an example. 1920s. You had an early series of experiments in credit. It wasn't widespread, but there were many department stores which would allow you to buy certain expensive items on credit. You would make a monthly payment. This is installment credit, and people would use it. It was actually pioneered back in the 1850s by the Singer Sewing Machine Company. They had a famous campaign to sell their sewing machine. $1 down and $1 per month. And you can own a Singer sewing machine. Okay? And that's the way this worked. For certain items, from certain retailers, credit was available to you. On the other hand, it was very limited. You couldn't use your credit card to buy a hamburger at a restaurant. Nobody would loan you money for that purpose. Okay? About 75% of the cars in the 1920s were purchased on credit. Mortgages started to emerge as a major industry. But the mortgages in this period were much different than the mortgages we see today. Typical mortgage required a 50% down payment and had to be repaid in 3 to 5 years. Compare that to the mortgages that were being offered during the housing boom in the mid-2000s, when you could have these low documentation loans. You didn't have to prove employment. You didn't necessarily have to provide a down payment. You had this adjustable rate, and it's just a world of difference. So credit was used, but in a very limited way, and most people still have this value of temperance, of thrift. 1950, we get the first credit card, the Diners Club card, which could be used at more than one retailer. Unlike the installment buying in the 1920s, now we have this kind of general credit, but it's only available to a certain few who are very credit worthy and only used at particular places. 1958, then we have the first all-purpose personal consumer line of credit, Bank AmeriCard. Now, these things are good things. Entrepreneurs created these kinds of financial services, and I think they're good if the person who's using them is good, if they have the virtue of temperance. And they can actually help you practice the virtue of temperance. And I think it's a good idea for a young person to have a credit card if they're using it in the right way. But you can look at what's happened to consumer debt over the years in the post-war period. Consumer debt crept up for a while, but it just started to zoom up in the late 1970s and right to the current time period. Here's a good example of what we're looking at as the so-called middle class today. There was a documentary done by National Public Radio called The Vanishing Middle Class, and they interviewed a series of individuals that they thought were under financial pressure. And this is Ryan and Kim Payne, a young couple that they both work. Ryan earns $70,000 a year. Kim earns $80,000 a year, which I think most of us would consider very good incomes. They decided to purchase a house for $640,000. Their mortgage payment is $4,000 a month. They also have $25,000 in credit card debt. And that's not surprising. They pay $3,000 a month for child care. So they're paying for child care and your mortgage and your installment loans on your credit card and so forth. I'm surprised they have anything else besides their home. They're house poor. What if one of them loses their job? They're one bad event away from catastrophe. This is not living as a bourgeois. This is recklessness. It's not courage. It's recklessness. Another thing, besides this increased acceptance of personal debt, we also had an increased acceptance of public debt, of our government going into hock for our benefit, so that we could go to our representative and say, can you give me more stuff so I can enjoy a higher living standard, but don't charge it to me. Borrow it. And you can see the stuff that you're going to the government to. This is something that a peasant in Europe might have gone to the lord of the manor and said, you know what, here's what would make my life better. What can you do about this? A member of the bourgeois would say, I want these things, how can I do it for myself? President Roosevelt, in this particular fireside chat, talked about a second Bill of Rights, which he wanted all Americans to have and which has pretty much been developed all the way through. Adequate food, clothing, recreation. Sounds great. The only question here is how? And that is a question which is left unanswered. Society will do it. And you can see here how spending has changed in response to these new national priorities. This is spending in 1960 here on the left, and that big blue chunk is national defense. 50% of our federal budget went towards national defense. And by 2004, even though we'd invaded Iraq at that point, we only had 20% of our federal budget going towards national defense. And you can see most of the rest is basically transfer payments of one kind or another. We have health care spending, we have interest on the debt, which is a form of transfer payment, ultimately. Social Security. These are spending, are types of spending in which people didn't exactly earn this stuff. We call it entitlements. You're entitled to the stuff as a citizen of the nation. But who, again, how do we pay for it? One of the other things that I think contributed to the decline of temperance or thrift is the intellectual development in economics, which we call the Keynesian revolution. It's the Keynesian revolution which is behind the idea that we can spend our way out of recessions, or more accurately, we can borrow our way out of recessions. And this is the cash for clunkers. To me, is the epitome of Keynesian ideas badly applied. What bourgeoisie, or what member of the bourgeoisie would throw his car away if it's in good working order and go out and buy a brand new one? How wasteful is that? And yet that's what our government was paying people to do. Now, in all honesty, maybe I'm upset with this because my car didn't qualify. I came so close to having a clunker. I had a 1995 Chrysler Concorde. It got 20 miles to the gallon. That's too much. If only it had gotten 19 miles to the gallon, then I could have qualified for a $4,000 grant from the government to buy a new car. Instead, I was stuck with it. I drove it for a couple more years, and I ended up selling it for $500. I know I'm not looking for your sympathy, but you know the point is, somebody, if I had qualified, if my car had been just a little less efficient, then taxpayers would have been paying me, Professor Matcheck, $4,000 for a car that's only worth $500. And to add insult to injury, they wouldn't have driven the car afterwards. They would have simply thrown it away. You can see the result in government finances. This is government finances since 1950. Even in 1950, you can see our annual budget was balanced. In fact, We were able to pay down some of the debt that had been accumulated during World War II. You can see what's been happening really in the 1970s and accelerating after that, with only a slight period of surpluses during the 1990s. We've basically been adding to our national debt every year. As Dr. Nash told you yesterday, there are three ways government can spend for all these things that it's promised. One of them, of course, is borrowing. Another is inflation. And you can see what's happened to inflation since 1800 in this country. You can see the price level on this graph and how the price level for many years, although there were fluctuations up and down, there was no systematic tendency for the price level to go up. The systematic tendency for the price level to go up, in other words, constant inflation, didn't really start until after we abolished the gold standard. And once we delinked the currency from gold, all of a sudden the discipline that had been on the system is taken away, and of course we've been inflating ever since. Do I have a mouse here? Okay. I thought you might enjoy this little video. I'm not sure if you've seen this yet, but it's one of my favorites. It illustrates the situation our government is in by using the analogy of a consumer. In this case, the consumer who's represented in the video is going in to ask for more money, to borrow some more money, because he's running a little bit short. The numbers that appear in the video are equivalent to the numbers that correspond to the reality of our government finances. So the numbers have been scaled back a little bit, but they are the right proportion. Is there any way for me to center this?
What can I do for you today?
I would like to raise my debt limit.
Excuse me?
My debt limit, I'd like to raise it.
Because the last time I checked, Mr. Smith, you were in serious debt.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. Figure we should raise that limit.
Yeah, it says here you're $140,270 in debt.
Right, so I figured we should raise that limit to about $170,000. I just bought a 60-inch flat screen. Have you ever been to Australia?
No.
Leaving tomorrow, mate. You should check it out. Great parasailing.
Do you have some new income that I don't know about?
No, still making about 21 grand a year.
Okay. And are you still spending $38,000 a year?
That's what it says.
So you're adding $17,000 a year in debt.
Oh, is that what it comes out to? Debt limit going up. Ding.
Have you made any cuts in your expenses?
Oh, of course, yes. My wife and I cut $380 out of our annual budget. It's $380. Brutal.
Okay, so you're adding, okay, so you're adding $17,000 a year to your $140,000 in debt, and you cut $380.
Well, you say it like that, it makes it not sound like a lot.
Hey, maybe you should think about generating some new income, maybe a new job, maybe ask for that raise.
Oh, asking for that raise, that's not, I'm not comfortable. That's an awkward conversation. I've always been able to raise my debt limit.
Yeah, well, this is a little different.
Well, how?
We're in the middle of a recession, and your credit rating will plummet if you continue to go along this path.
I almost had it.
You don't see how bad this is, do you?
I cut my budget by $380. Are you kidding?
I'm sorry, Mr. Smith. We can't help you.
You're just a little like.
I'm very sorry.
My wife is going to lose it.
Been there.
I mean, $380 was bad enough. I mean, this is going to end our marriage. We stopped talking to each other for a month. The baby was totally freaked out.
Wait. You have kids?
Yeah. Yeah.
Sign there.
All right. Aren't kids a blessing? I mean, she's got plenty of time to deal with all this, right?
Absolutely.
Are we all set?
You're all set.
All right. Let's go, kiddo. We got to meet Mommy at the car store. Here we go. I think this is yours.
Thank you. Enjoy.
Thanks. Hey.
in a way, I enjoy that. The bourgeois culture would never tolerate exploiting your children in quite so direct a manner. In fact, the whole idea of that is to make your children, in some sense, better off, to give them the start in life that allows them to even exceed your lifestyle, your living standards. So I want to point out, if you have the accoutrements, the appearance of a middle-class lifestyle, you're taking the vacation, you're living in the big house, you're driving the car, but you don't have that connection with individual responsibility that, yeah, I did this myself, yeah, I'm prudent about my future, yeah, I'm concerned about the next generation, then it's questionable to me whether or not there really is a middle class there. It just seems to me like there's something missing. So, I want to take another break now.